today I'm here with a mother of a transgender kid, a kid who has gender dysphoria, gender issues. I really hate to use the word transgender kid because I don't believe that there actually are true transgender kids. But I'm not using her name and we're not using her image on this because she has a relationship with her daughter and she wants to maintain that. And unfortunately, in the climate that we live in, she would potentially be jeopardizing that if she appeared with her name and her image on a video. But she does want to share her experience, which is, I think, important for all of us to hear about. So concerned mom, can you just tell us what your experience has been?
Well, I agree, Erin. I don't call my daughter a transgender kid, and she is my daughter. She is female. I should know. I'm her mom. I was there, when she was born. She is just a teenager with gender dysphoria, and I don't want to minimize that. I think that her distress is very real, but I think it's important. That we recognize it for what it is, that it's not being born in the wrong body, that she has this inner gender essence that is actually male, but she has a female body. I just think that she's experiencing some discomfort around the idea of being female. And I think the reason why it's important to recognize that is because how do we treat her distress and the distress that teens like her are experiencing if we don't really recognize the problem? If we look at it as a transgender identity, it's going to have a very different treatment than if we really look at their distress and the causes behind it.
And I think that's such an important point because I hear transgender activists say that this is a normal developmental path. And if that were the case, then they wouldn't be having to use medical interventions that cause harm to the
Mhm.
body. And that's kind of where my concern comes from, is that I don't have a problem with people being gender creative, not adhering to strict gender stereotypes. I think that that's wonderful and should be celebrated. What really bothers me is that in this case, they're saying it's a normal developmental path, and yet in order to treat it, they do things to the healthy body that harm it. And so tell us a little bit about your daughter. How old was she when she started to experience gender dysphoria, and what kind of how you've approached it, if you've affirmed it, or if you've tried to work with her?
Well, it's been about 3 years now, and my approach has evolved as I've learned more, um, and as I've observed different things and things I've encountered in real life, and with my daughter and with other teenagers that I've met, and also just things that I read and learned in this time. So she's 16 now. When she was 13, right before she told me that she was transgender, um, I had seen this going on in my community. So I was aware that there were a lot of kids just suddenly identifying as trans. It was mostly females. Um, and my initial thought was these kids are just experimenting with gender, and I thought that's cool. Um, Around 20, well, just about the time that she told me that she was identifying as trans, I read this Time magazine article um, about this. I forget the name of it. I think it was called Beyond He or She, and it really it really rang true with what I had already seen with teenagers that I knew, that kids were going by different pronouns and identifying as trans or not, or non-binary, and going by they, them, or he, she, or she, her. So, um, and my thought was, that's cool. Okay, that was because I didn't really realize the extent that there were medical interventions happening. I just thought that these are kids who are challenging gender roles and stereotypes, and I'm playing around with things like clothing and hairstyles and makeup, and I thought, well, there's nothing wrong with that, and there is nothing wrong with that. Okay. Um, I couldn't quite understand it though, because I'm like, what, why, how is that any different than just being gender nonconforming? Why do we have to have labels for it? And
So
but
did your daughter want you to call her by male pronouns, and did she have a different name that she wanted you to call her?
yeah, so when she was 13, I remember she asked me one day if she had been born a boy, what name um, would her dad and I have given her. And so, and at that, when I was pregnant, I didn't know if I was having a boy or a girl until she was born. And so we had a boy name picked out. And so I told her that name. And then about a month later, she's always um, experienced some mental health difficulties, and she has been seeing a therapist for a very long time. And her therapist invited me into one of their sessions and asked if what she said that my daughter wanted to tell me something. And so she told me that they had been discussing gender identity, and that the therapist even gave her a workbook to work through, which I kind of
I'm
cringe at that.
assuming was very affirming.
Yes, and I kind of cringe at that now, because I think what that does is it sets up a framework for this idea of gender identity, which I think is an ideology. I think it's a made up thing. And I think if you give that to a 13-year-old who's just trying to figure out themselves, um, it it's going to plant some ideas into their head.
Especially if it's given to them by a therapist.
Right. And kind of guide them, where they're going to say, well, I don't feel like the other girls, I feel uncomfortable in my body. I like these things that are stereotypically male, or I don't like these stereotypically girl things. So I just think if you set it up that way, that they are very likely to come to a certain conclusion.
And it
And
is an ideology, like you said.
mhm,
It's almost, to me, reminds me of a cult in that
mhm,
how it works, and that first you enter, you start to be provided with this language, with this belief system, and then you're told to ostracize anybody who doesn't conform to that, who doesn't affirm you.
mhm.
And so I can't imagine as a parent sitting there and the therapist and finding out that your daughter had basically been indoctrinated into this ideology. Were you aware of how damaging the ideology was at the time?
At the time, I didn't know, and I actually don't think that the therapist knew at the time, and I don't think she knows now either. Since then, my daughter's seeing a different therapist, but I I started to learn more about things like detransitioners and some gender critical viewpoints, and I did share them with that therapist. I shared her the website Gender Health Query, which I think is a great resource for anybody. It's genderhealthquery.org, and I think it's just ghq.org if anyone wants to find that. A great resource that just pulls together so many other resources. It's just a great place to begin. So I shared that with her, and she said, thanks for the information. Because I think what she is being told as a therapist, because this is kind of a new thing. If you've been a therapist, and I think maybe you're suddenly getting, having clients who are trans or identifying as trans. And I think the guidance that she's been given are things like that she would be given from WPATH. So, the word.
Well, and in some states, she's actually required to affirm.
That's true too.
And
Yeah.
so that's what's scary, is that at least in Utah, if a child went in, the therapist would have no other option but to affirm. And so that might
And
have
I
been the
think
case with that therapist. So
and that is absolutely true. They are in a position where they have to do that. But anyway, so they had worked this out, and my reaction at the time was okay. I mean, I guess I kind of saw it coming because of the question that she had asked me earlier, and I had already seen a lot of her friends identifying as trans, and it just seemed like just about every week there was just another one. no, that person wants to be called this name and these pronouns. And
Well, and in some ways, as a mother of a teenager, at least when I was a mother of a teenager, I wanted to pick my battles. And
mhm,
so if one of my kids came home and said this, back before I understood how damaging the ideology was, I probably would have just said, yeah, all right, thinking no big deal. This is just like, my daughter went through a phase where all she wanted to wear was like fur
mhm,
jackets, and I went with it.
right,
I think a lot of parents respond the way you did, sort of like, okay, this seems to be the fad right now. No harm done. I'll just go with it.
yeah.
'Cause there are other battle. I don't want to alienate my kids, and there are other things as a parent that I need to be concerned about.
And yet I never really bought into it because it came on very suddenly. Okay.
So your
And
daughter was not a kid who was gender nonconforming as a child.
I would say um, you could describe her as a tomboy. I mean, just very active. Of course, girls are active too, but just love to be outdoors. Love to play in the mud and the dirt, and didn't like to brush her hair. Just kind of a wild kid. I mean, but
But not
also
saying that she felt like a boy ever.
never felt uncomfortable with anything girly. And I hesitate to even say girly because what does that even mean? But no, never, never really had an issue with being female.
So she would probably fall into the category of rapid onset gender dysphoria.
Um, Totally fits the profile of it. Okay,
Can you
so
explain that to people who aren't familiar with that terminology?
okay, yes. So ROGD, or rapid onset gender dysphoria, that term comes from the physician Lisa Littman, who came out with a paper in about 2 years ago. I think it was August 2018. And she had just noticed this phenomenon where there's just this sudden increase of teenagers, mostly girls, who showed no gender dysphoria or gender nonconformity in childhood, and then around adolescence, around puberty, started to just suddenly just announce that they were transgender. And her
And it's
study,
clustered in the same
right,
way your daughter is, clusters of it.
right, yeah. So her study was based on interviews or surveys of parents, um, and it really identified, and it was almost 300 parents, and it identified certain trends, like cluster groups of friends coming out as trans, um, a lot of time spent online, in social media groups, like watching YouTube videos, Tumblr, just certain social media sites that where there's lots of transgender teens sharing their stories. A lot of transition timelines on YouTube.
And I believe,
uh,
I'm not sure about this, but a lot of these kids also do have underlying mental
they
health
do.
issues,
Yeah, they have underlying mental health issues, such as anxiety, depression,
autism.
autism spectrum. And my daughter was diagnosed as being on the autism
I
spectrum
was wondering about
in
that
fourth
because I
grade.
think
Yeah.
that a lot of girls who are gender nonconforming actually fall on the gender autism spectrum,
Hmm.
and so they're, that's the diagnosis, and unfortunately they're being told that they're born in the wrong body when in fact they have, they're on the autism spectrum.
Yeah, and I think that really makes a lot of sense, because if you're struggling with social skills and fitting in with other girls, I think you could totally think, oh, that's because I'm not really a girl. And I remember feeling like that when I was that age. Uh, I'll just tell you a little story. I'll just get sidetracked a little bit, but um, just as I've been thinking about this memory of this summer camp that I used to go to every summer, where I would be, it was fun, for the outdoors and, things that you get to do at camp. But just socially, it was really hard for me because I was placed in this, cabin with girls my age. And I always felt so lonely because I just felt like they all like really formed this close group, and I always felt lonely and left out. And I just remember always just feeling a little sad every time I went to camp. And then around 6th or 7th grade, um, because I wasn't really fitting in with the girls, I started talking to the boys because they were easier to talk to. And um, I remember some of the girls in my cabin, they were really starting to get interested in boys and having crushes on them. And they were asking me all these questions like, how do you talk to the boys? How come you're so good at talking to boys? That they wanted to, you know, they
Use
wanted
your
to know.
expertise.
Right. And I just said, well, you just talk about, I just said, we just talk about Star Trek. And, that was my answer to that. And then I said, and I have some friends who are boys at my school, and at recess we play basketball. And I wasn't really athletic, but I like to shoot hoops. And so they said, oh, that's a great idea. Let's organize a basketball game with the boys. So they had set this up, they had planned this. And I remember that for them, it was just this big thing, like getting to hang out with the boys. And they spent
A
an
flirt
hour.
fest.
It was, and they spent an hour getting ready to go play basketball, where they were carefully picking their outfit, putting on makeup, doing their hair.
And you're like,
I was like, I didn't even know, it never occurred to me to even bring makeup or a curling iron, to summer camp. I'm like, I didn't even have makeup. And so I was just waiting, like, are you girls
you were
ready?
like me, you were somewhat annoyed at what was
Yes.
taking them so long.
Yeah. So, I mean, I know what that's like. Okay. And I just think that somebody now growing up like that is going to just feel like, maybe if you're told that it's possible to have a gender identity that's different than your biological sex, you might start to believe that. I mean,
And that's what I think is so damaging, is that, like you were talking about sports. When I was in junior high, I was very aggressive. We would play field hockey, and the girls did not like to play with me because I was really aggressive. And
mhm,
so they ended up putting me on the boys team. And that was fine with me, and it was fine with the boys, and that was a good solution because the girls were not happy with me being so aggressive. But now
mhm,
I would be told you're born in the wrong body, because that's
right.
now the narrative. And to me, that is just so sad that these kids who are just a little bit different, instead of us embracing the difference and celebrating it, we're
Mhm.
saying you're inherently flawed, you're born in the wrong body. It just seems like such a horribly sad message to tell a kid.
Yeah. Yeah. So back to the Lisa Littman study. When that came out, I was already starting to question what's going on with these girls, what's going on with my daughter. And I had found the Fourth Wave Now blog, which was really helpful to. That's a lot of parents telling their stories about their um, girls, mostly girls who are suddenly trans, right? And so I was already starting to think this way and notice this. And then because I was following the issue, I knew right away when the Lisa Littman paper came out. And I thought, finally, there's some research being done on this, and we really need some information. People need to know what's going on. And then in a week, trans activists had already attacked the paper. Brown University, where Lisa Littman was on the faculty. She might still be on the faculty. I don't remember there. But the Brown University pulled the press release from their website because it was too controversial, And then,
And I really want to emphasize this, because I want people to realize that this was a valid study that was done.
mhm, yes,
It wasn't questioned about methodology or
mhm,
conclusions. There was nothing about it that was flawed,
right,
except for activists did not like the conclusion, the
yes,
results, the scientific results. And
yes.
to me, that is incredibly scary when someone does good quality, valid research and it's removed because of ideological pressure from activists.
Yes, and people really need to know what's going on, because if they don't, if they really, believe that their rapid onset gender dysphoria or ROGD kid is trans, they could very easily be led down this medical path. And one of the reasons why you asked to interview me was because of a discussion that we had on social media about my experience with a pediatric endocrinologist. And
Yeah, why don't you tell us about that? Because that
yeah,
just blew me away.
right. So you would wonder why, I mean, hearing what I already think of this, why would I take my daughter to a gender clinic? That's a good question.
Was
Because
it your daughter's idea or the therapist's idea?
it was my daughter's idea, and knowing what I know now, I would not have taken her there. But you know, early on, I really wanted to learn about what does being transgender mean, and so some of the first resources that I came up with were the more mainstream ones that uh, encourage you to affirm your child's identity. And so so I was just trying to figure things out. And so my daughter's therapist and our family physician just said, there is a gender or an LGBTQ clinic in our community. And so, you might want to go check that out. And my daughter thought that would be a good idea because she told me that she just wanted to talk to somebody. She just wanted to explore her feelings and just ask some questions. And so I thought, well, someone who is a specialist in this area would be a good idea, right? So just someone to help her figure out what she's feeling. I now know that there's really no such thing as a therapist who will actually help your child to understand their gender identity, because
Especially gender clinic, because I think
right.
for people who don't know what a gender clinic is, it really is specifically set up with this ideology that affirmation is the best approach and to get kids on a path towards medically transitioning, which involves puberty blockers, hormones, and surgery.
And that's absolutely true. Yes. And I've seen it happen, not with my own child, but with other kids I know. So I really just thought, well, let's just call and just see if she can talk to somebody. And I was thinking something like a therapist. So I made the appointment, and I did not ask to see an endocrinologist, but that was who we ended up seeing. And so,
and how old was she at the time?
so this was 2 years ago. This was at the end of 8th grade. She was 14. So she introduced herself. She said she was an endocrinologist, and I said, I didn't really, intend to make an appointment with an endocrinologist. And she said, oh, that's okay. I talk to parents and kids in your situation all the time. And she just said, just tell me what's going on. So my daughter explained how she felt and that she'd been feeling this way for about a year. And they talked for about a half an hour. Okay. I was in the room, and then after that, this endocrinologist completely affirmed my daughter's self-diagnosis of gender dysphoria and being transgender, and just said, well, what we can do here for you is at your age, we can put you on puberty blockers. At age 14, she had already started puberty, but she just said, it will just, it's like pressing a pause button. It'll just stop you from developing, any further. It'll just put the pause on puberty. So any further changes that would happen will just stop.
Had you heard of puberty blockers prior to now?
I had, because I watch a lot of TED Talks because some of them are interesting. And I just, even before, this had happened with me personally, I came across there was a TED Talk with Norman Spack, who was the doctor, right? The doctor who first introduced the idea of puberty blockers for these trans kids. And even at that time, I didn't know really what I thought of that. But at that time, I also thought that was a really rare condition. But I thought too, I'm like, do they really know that they're told that they're trans? Is that a good idea? So yeah, I knew what that was, what that was about, and the doctor really framed it in such a way that this is just totally safe. It's safe. It's reversible. It's just, just stopping puberty, and that's it. And it just gives you time
Just
to,
stopping puberty, just
right.
stopping one of the
I
biggest
mean, that
developmental
is
processes human beings go through.
exactly right, right. So, and then, if you decide to stop, then, you could just stop and then you just resume puberty. Or when you're 16, if this identity still persists and you want to go on cross sex hormones, you can do that. Now, she didn't talk about surgery, but she's an endocrinologist.
Well, and in some ways, the fact that she was saying that your daughter had to wait till 16 is encouraging, because there are gender clinics that will put them on puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones.
Mm-hmm.
At a very young age, I know that there's one clinic in California that will put kids on cross-sex hormones as early as 8 years old. And
Mm-hmm.
so in a way, the endocrinologist you saw was actually moderate in her recommendations, which is really shocking.
Yeah, but there were some other things about that experience that I thought were a little bit weird. It really seemed to me like she was selling the idea a
Like,
lot.
look at this is
Yeah.
the
Now, as a pediatric endocrinologist, she also works with kids with diabetes. But she told me, or she told us, she's like, working with trans kids is my favorite part of my job, because it's like rainbows and unicorns when I can help kids be who they really are.
Whoa.
And I thought that was I thought her enthusiasm was a bit weird
Yeah, because
because,
I mean, she's a doctor. She should
right.
be looking like, how did she diagnose the need for puberty
Hmm.
blockers? What is that based upon, other than your daughter saying that? I mean, when you treat a child with diabetes, there are some very clear
Exactly.
diagnostic tests that you run, and you know if you're treating it or not. Whereas with puberty blockers, um, we know that they stop puberty, but we don't know if that's a good idea. And I'm guessing if that was a couple years ago, um, there's been more and more and more
Mhm.
information about how very dangerous puberty blockers are.
Right.
In addition to stopping puberty, they also cause some long-term side effects.
And yes, and if I were to talk to her today, I would say, well, is it like rainbows and unicorns when these kids have brittle bones and their bodies start falling apart? Um, is it like rainbows and unicorns when the cross-sex hormones cause terrible effects? Like, they cause your reproductive organs to shut down and they cause
Atrophy.
vaginal atrophy. I mean, that sounds terrible, right?
Well, and
So,
it's interesting with the puberty blockers, you're not just blocking the physical development, you're blocking the mind's development, the brain development. So you're
yeah.
basically inducing a developmental delay in a
Hmm.
child.
Yeah.
A cognitive, academic, emotional, cognitive delay. So they're going to be you're inducing a delay that's going to cause them to not keep up with their peers.
Yes, I find that to be very creepy. And then some of the other things that she said that I thought were irresponsible. I I was kind of blindsided by the experience, because I didn't know that that was what we were going to be discussing at that appointment. So I was just like, wait a minute. I'm like, I don't feel really comfortable with this. I'm like, and she goes, she's like, I understand, but you do need to keep in mind that if you do nothing, your daughter is, no, sorry, she said your son is at risk for suicide.
She really said that
She said that
with your daughter in the room.
yes, yes.
Wow.
So that is just planting this idea in her head
That to
that
me is so irresponsible.
it
Like, it
is.
infuriates me that a doctor would say that in front of your daughter.
Yes, I can't even believe it. That and I do think, I mean, that suicide thing keeps getting brought up over and over again. The statistic that like 40% of of trans people attempt suicide. And I, that sounds really scary, right? I mean, it's a parent's worst
It's really
nightmare.
important to look at the attempts.
It's
Because
attempts, and it's also
because what
important to.
a lot of times they're very sort of dramatic staged attempts
Mhm,
that are not, I don't know how to put this in a way that is not, I have to be really careful, but these are attempts that seem to be more calls for attention than
mhm,
actual, that are actually going to, than anything that's going to result in an actual harm. Um, but I think one of the concerns that you brought up is if a doctor tells a child that the appropriate response to not getting what they want is suicide, then it's not surprising that the suicide attempts are that high.
right. I mean, we know. I mean, some people have suggested that gender dysphoria in teens right now is a social contagion, and I think there's plenty of evidence to show that. But it's been well documented that suicide is a social contagion too. And so I think if you tell kids that they are at risk for suicide, it's just going to give them the idea. And the
Well,
other thing about that,
how did you respond? I'm trying to imagine. I would just be,
well, I cried. I mean, when someone tells you that your child's at risk for suicide, I mean, I just was in tears. Okay. Um, um,
and
and
how was your daughter responding to all this? Was she excited or?
she, once she got that idea that she could be put on puberty blockers, for a few months after, she really wanted that. And I said, I just don't know about this. And one of the things that bought me time was at that time, um, she was on her dad's insurance, and his insurance didn't cover this. Okay. Later on, she got on my insurance, and it would cover it, but that just ended the discussion. I said, well, you're on your dad's insurance, that doesn't cover it. And
Whew,
yeah, right. Because the Lupron, the puberty blocking drug, is very expensive.
it's crazy expensive.
Isn't it about like 800 a month or
At
something?
least, yeah,
Right.
it's outrageously expensive.
Right, which totally shows that people are making money off of this, and that makes me very suspicious. So what she wanted, she had a friend whose mom put her on puberty blockers, a friend who doesn't even identify as trans, but as non-binary. Okay. Um, so I don't understand why you would need
Which
to
is,
treat.
yeah, I mean, basically what you're doing is you're putting this developing girl's body into menopause
Yes.
before it, I mean, yeah. I don't,
Yeah.
I still like when I hear it, it just boggles my mind that anybody thinks this is a good idea.
Right. I mean, I'm in my 40s now, and menopause is on the horizon for me, and I'm not looking forward to it at all. And I can't imagine putting a teenager through that. That's terribly irresponsible.
So
I
that was a while ago. How is she doing since then? Has she been pushing to get on puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones?
No, no. So yeah, I'll finish what I was saying earlier. So she had a friend whose mom was on it, and she said, "Well, just talk to so and so's mom," because and she said, "Just do some research." And I said, "I just don't know if they're safe." And she said, "Well, look it up." And so I did, and I couldn't find any evidence that they're safe. So she really kind of dropped it after a while, and um, she's 16 now. So I mean, I know puberty is a long process, but for her it started early, and so I think she's kind of, you know probably at the end of puberty. And um, I can tell that she still feels some discomfort in her body, but that's totally a female experience, isn't it?
I was gonna say, I don't know of any woman a girl who went through
Mhm.
puberty and found it to be a completely wonderful experience. I mean,
Right.
even as a woman now, sometimes there are so many expectations put upon
Okay.
female bodies.
Hmm.
But it's not surprising to me that this is happening primarily to girls, adolescent girls, because that's when all of a sudden, these expectations about what you're supposed to look like, what is beautiful, what is acceptable, really start hitting. And it's just, I think it's incredibly damaging to these kids, so much so that they'd rather say they're male than embrace their female body that's not going to meet the expectations that are being put upon them.
Right, and I also think it's a way of protecting themselves because I mean, um, there are many ways in which being female can make us very vulnerable, and I think that they hear a lot of stories about sexual assaults, and as they start to develop, they get unwanted attention from males that makes them uncomfortable. I mean, I remember when she was 12, she told me one time she was at the public library with a friend and some older guy was like, "Hey cutie," and she was like, "That's so gross," and she was really creeped out by that. And I think that this um, identity can in some ways protect them from that a little bit, or they think that it's protecting them from that unwanted attention. And the thing about her is she really doesn't say that she is a guy or that she's male. She knows that. I think she just tells me that she doesn't want to be female, or she has a hard time seeing herself as female. And I try to challenge that a little bit because I just say, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be female? Um,
And unfortunately, the message that they're getting now means that to be female is that you adhere strongly to
mhm.
stereotypical these stereotypes. And so it is a good question. I mean, I don't even know myself at this point what some people are defining woman as, because I don't recognize it.
No, and I don't really have this, I don't have a feeling of gender. I really don't. I just have the experience of being in a body that's female, and to me, that's all that it is. Now, I don't feel any discomfort with that, and I do recognize that that's really what trans identified people are experiencing is discomfort with their biological sex. But we know that, I mean, people want to sell this idea that transition is the answer to that. And the fact that we're seeing so many people who have detransitioned and said that transition did not make them happy, it did not solve their problems. Um, and then they were able to resolve their gender dysphoria with things like cognitive behavioral therapy and even just maturity and growing up. Um,
And that is
so,
so critical, I think, is that a lot of times these kids are kind of they're put on this pathway, and they're told that they'll feel better if they
mhm,
transition. And so
yeah.
there's almost an urgency. They get the puberty blockers, and that doesn't necessarily help, so then they want to get the hormones, and that doesn't necessarily help, so then they get the surgeries, and then they've done all this to their bodies, and they still have these underlying issues, because the underlying issues were what caused the gender dysphoria in the first place.
Mhm,
And so to me, it's heartbreaking, because it's like they're chasing, the gold at the end of the rainbow, and they can't ever get there. And,
mhm.
and then they realize they're never going to get there, and that they were told, they were misled to believe that this was going to solve all their problems.
And I can understand why they fall into that. I mean, back to when that doctor told me that my daughter was at risk for suicide. Another thing I want to say about that is that, you know, a lot of these trans identified kids have underlying mental health conditions, and just trans identified people in general. I mean, there is definitely an overlap there. So I think it's impossible to determine if they did attempt suicide, whether it was the mental health issues or their trans identity.
Well, and
Okay.
one of the things that I'm hearing more and more is that they're not suicidal because of their trans identity. They're suicidal because of the stigma and because of how society treats them as a result of being transgender, which is actually very different from what your doctor said. So they're
Mhm.
almost giving these two very different narratives. One, they'll kill themselves if you don't allow them to transition. Oh, actually, they're killing themselves because of social stigma. And yet, we know, first of all, that there have been people who have been horribly stigmatized and treated, just incredibly heinously by society, and their suicide rates aren't that high.
Mm-hmm.
So that doesn't really work. And we also know that most of these kids will desist with those feelings if they're not encouraged to transition. So that doesn't. So both of the explanations that are being given by activists for the high suicide rate really don't pan out.
Yeah. And that desistance rate of 80%, I think that there are at least 11 different studies that show that. And they all have a slightly different percentage of desistance, but it's in that range
It's
of about
high. It's really
80%.
high.
Super
And we
high.
also have a very good study from Sweden that shows that people who go through the full transition have an incredibly high rate of actual suicide completions.
Mm-hmm.
So if the whole goal is to lower actual completed suicides, then we would definitely not encourage medical transitioning.
Exactly. But I feel like people don't really know that. They're not being told that. Um, so we had discussed, I just had told you that we had discussed this with our family physician too. It's just something that has come up at just regular checkups because, you know, my daughter has said that she wants to be called by a different name. And so um, at her last checkup, he had asked, he's like, hey, did you ever visit or make an appointment with the gender clinic or the LGBTQ clinic? And my daughter goes, my mom's not supportive. And
Uh,
so I explained to our doctor my feelings on that, and I told him about the Lisa Littman study. He had no clue. I told him about the 80% desistance rate. He did not know about that. I mean, he's a doctor, okay? So, I mean, if our medical professionals don't know this, I mean, I feel like I had to really dig to find the truth.
Well, it's because trans activists are trying to
Mhm.
silence it. And I
Yeah,
know that, I mean, I see that everywhere, just um, they're trying to disparage anybody who speaks out about this.
yeah.
And it's so concerning to me. And that's why I feel like it's more a cult than it is, this isn't a medical condition. This isn't a mental health issue. It's become
Mhm.
almost a cult because they're trying to control the narrative so much. If this were really about science, then people would be embracing the idea of research. And there's actually a researcher in England who wanted to do research on desistance
Is that
because,
James Caspian?
yeah, because he
Yeah.
was
Mhm.
seeing this all over the place.
Yeah.
This guy wrote up a good proposal, and then it got denied by the university, and it was all because the university was worried about political pushback. And so
Mhm.
here's somebody who's actually trying to study desisters to see if we could figure out, wouldn't it be great if we could figure out what, we know the 80% who are going to desist. Wouldn't it be great if we could figure out some markers for that 80% so we know the kids who aren't going to desist, and maybe we can give very different care if we can find that out, but we're not even allowed to research it.
Yeah, and that's a huge red flag to me. It's incredibly disturbing. And if you think about any other medical condition that you might have, that's an actual medical condition, okay? What if let's just say that there was something going on with your body, okay? And you were told, um, this is not life threatening, it might cause you some discomfort, but the good news is if you just wait, there's an 80% chance that it'll just go away on its own,
Completely. It'll completely
right?
go away.
That would be the treatment that they would most likely recommend would be watchful waiting,
Well, and
right?
that's typically doctors go for the less invasive,
Hmm.
the less harmful treatments. And in this case, it's just exactly the opposite.
Yeah, yeah. And it is very easy, I think, for parents to go along with what they're told. And I have met
Well,
parents.
because they're told that you can have um, a, a transgender kid or a dead kid.
Mhm.
They're
Right,
given that same narrative. And so it's not surprising at all to me that parents go along with
right.
it.
I guess I'm just a natural skeptic. I mean, I've always been that way. When I was in first grade, I figured out there wasn't a Santa Claus. So, spoiler alert, sorry about that. But,
You
you
were
know,
that kid.
right. I was that kid, and I had a whole class, full of kids who were mad at me, and the teacher had to pull me aside and say, you're right, just don't tell them because, don't want to hurt their feelings. And when I was a teenager, I grew up going to church, and I went to a Christian high school. And I know a lot of your guests have been Christian, and I really respect that, but I just couldn't believe a lot of the stuff in the Bible. Okay, I couldn't take it literally. Um, really was interested in science and was studying evolution, and didn't really feel like that had to conflict with the creation story. So I was always debating, always trying to find the truth, right? And when I was in high school, our school put on a production of The Emperor's New Clothes, and I wanted a bigger part, okay, but I wasn't a super talented actor, so I was cast as the kid with the one line, "I don't see any clothes," okay, and that means so much to me now. Like, that's who I really am, okay.
That's so
So um, when I first started researching what it means to be transgender and what it means to be a transgender teen, a lot of the resources that were telling me to affirm, I didn't feel like anything that I was reading was giving me the answers that I felt applied to my daughter, and that I really saw what was happening. So I just dug deeper, and so
Well, and I
and
think that that's how, um, when I first became aware of this, I had no idea that the medical transition was going on.
I didn't
I had
either.
no clue,
Hmm.
and I was just flabbergasted when I started finding out about the harms of puberty blockers. I mean, these kids are going to have lifelong problems from being
Okay.
on puberty blockers, and then the cross-sex hormones, which cause huge problems with the body, and we don't
Yeah.
even know because this is all new. And then what was the clincher for me is finding out that kids were having healthy body parts amputated. To me, that was just unbelievable. And I kept thinking, this must just not really be true. And I think that's a
It
lot
is
of
happening.
people, a lot of people think that, because when I found out about it and I started posting it on Facebook, a lot of people said, "Oh, that doesn't happen. Oh, that's not real. Oh, you're just making that up. You're just transphobic. You don't know what you're talking about."
I've it's happening. I've seen it. I know people who are going through this, and I also think that people think, well, it's rare, and those people must be truly trans. Okay, um, but if you think about my experience at that gender clinic, you think at how it just shows you how easy it is to get affirmed. And if you take your child there, or if if you're an adult and you go to a gender clinic, if you ask for that treatment, they will give it to you. We were told that we just needed. I mean, she wasn't going to do a prescription that day, right? But she said that if that was what we wanted, all you need is the permission of one parent, not both.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
mhm. And she also said a letter from a therapist. Okay. Now you would think, okay, well, that would be the gatekeeping. Okay. But it's not, because I think it would have been very easy for her therapist to write that letter.
Well,
And
and they have to in some
it
states. They're required to
right. And if you if you don't get the letter from one therapist, you'll just go to another one and find one who will give it to you.
Well, and that's what was something, I actually, when I found out about this, it was a couple years ago, I called the gender clinic at the University of Utah,
Mm-hmm.
and just kind of pretended to be a parent with a kid who was interested in treatment. And I said, I don't have a therapist. I'm not sure what to do. And they're, "No problem. We have them in house. We can come in and you can see the therapist and the medical doctor and the endocrinologist all in one visit." They just make it so easy. Um, and
Yeah.
so and what's concerning to me is that even that little tiny um, requirement of having a therapist is often now being challenged, that we shouldn't even require that, that's too invasive, that it's putting up some kind of a roadblock for kids to get it. And in some states, kids are getting it without parental permission.
Mm.
And so, I mean, I can't imagine how you would feel if your daughter went behind your back and you found out that she had been taking puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones without your consent?
I would find a lawyer. I mean, that's terrifying, but you know, what's scary for parents like me is when they turn 18. Now, luckily, my daughter, she's not insisting that she wants to go on cross-sex hormones. I really see that she's kind of coming out of this. I feel like I'm one of the lucky parents because I've heard stories of parents who their kids have transitioned after they turn 18, um, and
Well, I think the fact that you're skeptical and you've taught her to do research,
yeah.
I think that really helps, especially if she's maybe more scientifically minded. It's really easy to prove to somebody that this is not the appropriate treatment
Mhm.
if they're willing to look at the data.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what I have told her. I said, you know, you have learned about gender ideology, and it makes me mad when I call it that, but through um, you know, things you found online. There's a local youth center, which is great, sort of. I mean, at its heart, it's a great organization. It's a safe place for teenagers to hang out. There's um, an art studio and a music studio, a recording studio. And they just have a lot of just positive things for kids. But they also have a pride group, and I have nothing. There's nothing. I mean, I have no problems with the LGB part of pride. I mean, some
Well, and in
people.
fact, that's something that I did want to mention because I think a lot of parents, a lot of people don't realize that some of these kids are actually being pushed to transition because their parents are homophobic,
Mhm.
and they have a kid, maybe a male who's effeminate or a girl who's butch, and they're worried that that kid is gay, and so they encourage that child to believe they're transgender because they have a child. Then they end up with a child who presents as straight,
Mhm.
and they actually just released something from England, an NHS investigation that found that parents would come in and specifically ask their child to be medically transitioned because they didn't want a gay child. And so we've got this, LGB group that is, supporting kids who are homosexual. And then the T part, who is a lot of times encouraging that internalized homophobia or that social homophobia, and almost encouraging kids to transition if they feel like they're gay or lesbian.
Right, and the other side of that is that those studies on desistance, they show that most of the kids who have gender dysphoria and desist um, end up being gay or lesbian, and because in childhood and in the teenage years, I think some of those feelings can be confused of same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria. They kind of go together. So, you know, if you just let them grow up, and if they turn out to be gay, that's great. Love is love. I mean, I have no problem with that. So anyway, this youth center has this pride group, and they really do emphasize the gender part of it, and where um, yeah, they really promote it. And that's where I've seen a lot of these teenagers, you know, coming to feel like they're transgender, and it's almost like it's a by joining that group, it gives them sort of an instant peer group.
Well, I was thinking
Um,
about you and I talking about our experiences being kind of geeky, nerdy, not
mhm.
fitting in with the other girls. And if they had had something like that when I was a kid, I would have just loved it because it would have been a place where, my weirdness would have been affirmed
Right.
and
Yeah.
appreciated and embraced and encouraged. And so I feel like what these kids really need is a safe place where they can just be themselves
Yeah.
without being pushed to believe that they're inherently flawed and born in the wrong body.
Yeah. And I remember my daughter was going to hang out at this youth center, and then she'd come home and I would see these little handouts that she'd bring home. And one of them was, you know, the gender unicorn graphic and the genderbread person. And these printouts from um, I think it's Reddit. It was like these little illustrations, and the theme was "You are trans enough," and it was like, you know, even if you haven't felt like this way forever, you are trans enough, or even if, you know, you're still figuring yourself out, you are trans enough. So it seems like they're just really expanding this umbrella of who falls into the trans category. Um,
Well, I've been watching some lectures from the University of Minnesota,
mhm,
and it really is encouraging this idea of the trans umbrella, that
mhm.
anybody who doesn't 100% identify with the sex they were born is on the trans spectrum, which I don't know any woman who identifies like as a Barbie doll, which is sort of the what they're suggesting is identifying 100% as female, is that you're, you know, akin almost to a Barbie doll. And if you're a man, that in order to 100% embrace the idea of being a man, you're a GI Joe.
Right.
So it's absurd to me that they're suggesting that if you're anywhere in the middle, you're actually under the trans umbrella. You're transgender, or gender nonconforming, but it's all part of this transgender umbrella. It's almost like, um, no kidding, these kids are identifying as transgender because the information they're being given is absurd.
It is absurd, and I think it's really offensive because I don't really like this idea that you're setting up some ideal version of what a woman is.
And that
And I,
ideal version of a woman is not anything I identify with.
no, it's not. And I also think a lot of these girls who are identifying as boys, or some of our brightest, coolest, you know, gender non-conforming, like strong, like independent young
They're
women.
exactly what we were pushing for.
Right. And so I feel betrayed that they want that they want to opt out of womanhood, because I really think they need feminism. They just really need to um, just embrace the idea that there's not any right way to be a woman. And I really hope that that's what they are able to um, figure out eventually. So
So do you feel pretty optimistic about your daughter at this point?
I do. I do. And what I want to see is, for being a teenager is really hard. Being alive is hard, but but I think that when you're young, and you don't have good coping skills, those are things that have to be worked on. Um, it, it's just hard. So I just want her to just really work on her mental health, coping skills, and um, I tell her um, that the best way to be yourself is to, or to be the best version of yourself, is to have a healthy and functioning body. It's so important, right? So how can, you know, she's so smart, so talented. She's an artist and a musician, and just a really caring and empathetic person. And I think she's going to do great things in life. But, you know, how can we, you know, conquer the world, you know, if we're existing in a body that's been damaged by hormones that are inappropriate for our bodies, and for unnecessary surgeries. I mean, you know, you hear sad stories about people whose bodies are falling apart
Yeah,
because
they're
uh,
just heartbreaking.
mhm,
And it's interesting to me because if your daughter was cutting herself, then everybody would recognize that as self-harm.
mhm,
And yet now we have doctors that are actually encouraging self-harm, because
mhm.
that's what these puberty blockers and hormones and surgeries are. They
I see it that way. Mhm.
self-harm. And
Yeah.
so and again, I'm so thankful for the detransitioners who have medically transitioned, who are speaking out about their experience, because you know it's heartbreaking. But thank goodness they're sharing, because like you said, their bodies, some of them are just, you know, that, you know, they're 30 years old and their bodies are falling apart.
Right. And the story that a lot of trans identified people who have transitioned will say is, well, this makes me happy, you know, and I I think I think that they're lying to themselves. I mean,
Well, and
and
happiness is so ephemeral. Happiness
right.
is like it comes and goes. It's sort of this, I think that the fact that kids are even taught that happiness is the goal is a little concerning.
Mhm. Right.
Contentment and, there are all kinds of things we can be striving for, but
Mhm.
happiness is, it's not something that lasts. It's gonna, and it's based on a lot of times it's based on things you don't have control over.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and also this idea of worrying so much about how other people see us. And I think that
Yeah,
that's
that's a good point.
a huge
Yeah.
thing that you see in the trans community is policing people's language and expecting everybody to validate your identity.
Hmm.
And um, I don't really, feel like we all are entitled to have everybody validate who we think we are and see us the way we see ourselves. I mean, um,
Yeah,
I
we
don't
don't
think.
we don't get to dictate how other people perceive us.
Mhm. Right. And to me, so I have started to become a lot more firm in not using my daughter's preferred pronouns, or even her name, and I've just become more courageous in standing up about, you know, about that, because I know that she goes by a different name at school and pronouns, and I've just told the teachers, I'm like, you know what, I have some concerns about this, and I cannot use those pronouns because to me it feels like a lie, and so I just won't do it. And people have been pretty respectful of that.
I'm really glad to hear that because I know in some places they would actually accuse you of being a negligent and abusive parent.
Yeah, I
Um,
have been accused by people of that. And if I thought that I was harming my daughter, I wouldn't do it. But I actually think that I'm helping her, because I think the more you play pretend with some of these people, I think it. I guess I see what I'm doing as a form of, I guess, exposure therapy. Like,
and
if
it's
you
it's
completely avoid,
parenting.
yeah,
You're
if you
parenting her.
yes, if you completely avoid something that makes you uncomfortable, then you're never going to get over it. Okay. So I used to
Mhm.
see, so, my parents, they're in their 70s, and, they just, I think probably a lot of older people are just not going to get this, this trans thing. I don't really get it either, but so they have never, like, um, affirm this identity. They don't say much about it, but they just see it as, this will pass. And so they call her by her birth name, and um, she used to kind of cringe at that, and I can see now she's not phased by it.
Yeah,
And I
and it's
think the
important
more she
to,
hears that name,
yeah,
she realizes that it's not.
it's not harmful. It's not
No.
violence.
And when she was a kid, she was picked on a lot. She was bullied for being different. She was very emotional and would cry a lot at school, and kids called her a crybaby. And I think she has some trauma about that. And I've always thought that this trans identity for her was a way to be somebody different.
To run
And
away from that
yeah,
kid that was bullied and picked on. Yeah.
right, right,
Well, and it
and
gives her control because I
mhm,
mean, these kids get to say, "Call me this, treat me this way,"
mhm,
and so it's a way, it's a control. And
yeah,
and one of the things you're doing as a parent, I think, is setting up boundaries, which is exactly what parents are supposed to do. If you had a kid who came home and said, "I'd be really happy if I could use heroin," parents aren't supposed to say, "Oh, okay, yeah, I'll go down to the dealer and get you some."
right. I actually had this conversation with a friend of mine, and now she is a very successful, well-adjusted adult, and um, she has a 23-year-old daughter, and she said her daughter sure did test her, as a teenager, but and she feels the same way about what's going on with kids, and she actually is a high school teacher, and she sees it at her school, but she can't say anything about it. But she said the same thing. She said when she was a teenager, she was doing coke, and she said nobody stopped her. I mean, she said her mom walked in on her doing a line of coke, and and she lied and said it was a diet pill or something, and her mom believed it and didn't see the red flags, didn't, when she was so skinny, from not eating because she was doing coke and speed, her mom was like, oh, you're so cute, let's go shopping, right? So she said, my mom, and she loves her mother, okay, parents make all kinds of mistakes, it's hard being a parent, but she said, my mom was out to lunch, she said, I needed somebody to intervene in my life and stop me from doing that, and nobody did, and I feel like I'm protecting my daughter. And one of the things that has really helped me is just the feeling that I'm not alone. So, when other parents share their stories online or even personally, to know that I'm not the only one who feels this way. I haven't told you, I told you I've seen a lot of this in my community. And one day I was like, how many kids really have I met, either directly or indirectly? They're either my daughter's classmates or friends or my friends' kids, or coworkers' kids. I started listing them all, and there's at least 35 and counting. I mean, isn't that crazy?
Wow.
I mean,
And
those are just the ones I know. I mean,
that's the insane thing, is that
mhm.
transgender identity used to be like 0.01,
Mhm.
and now it's like starting to be 4 to 6%. And so if these kids are really being born in the wrong body, we should figure out what's going on. Like,
Right. We
I mean,
really,
something
really
really bad
should.
is happening.
So that's
And
another.
if you're like me, who thinks it's a social contagion,
Mhm.
like we went through a period where anorexia was
Yes.
really popular, and
Mhm.
kids were going and teaching each other how to throw up, and it was, it was a social contagion, and
Yes.
they handled it as such. And
Yes.
that's what's so frustrating to me about this, is that, if this was just kids dressing differently, that would be one thing, but
Mhm.
these are kids who are, damaging their bodies and
Right.
encouraged to do so.
Yeah, and back to that doctor that we saw, when I had brought that up about, well, I'm noticing a lot of kids who are identifying as trans, and at that time, the numbers that I knew were fewer. It just keeps going up. And she goes, yeah, well, that's just because, now there's more information out there, and people are more accepting of it. And so we would expect the numbers to increase. So that was her explanation. But to me, that wasn't scientific at all. That was just her, idea.
I mean,
And
you could have said that about anorexia too.
right,
I mean,
right. Yeah.
it's just that they're feeling more enabled to express their inner anorexia.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So, so along with all these kids that I have observed, I know some parents too. And, one of the things that really helped me to question this was, a friend that I've known for a long time. And, we would just interact on Facebook because she lived a couple hours away. But, she had told me that her daughter was going through the same thing. And she goes, I just don't know about this. She's like, if you ever want to talk about it, let's go have coffee or something. And just the fact that she just said, I just don't know about this, kind of gave me permission because I feel I live in a very um, liberal college town, everybody's woke, and I actually feel pressure to affirm my daughter's gender identity. And in fact, if I did, I could actually get cool points as a parent.
Right. You would be the good mom.
Yeah, I would be. People would be like, oh, that's so great that you let your son be themselves, and but so it's actually very isolating, to stand up to this and be the gender critical, parent.
And one of the
And
things that I'll do is I'll list some resources
mhm,
on the description for this, so that if there are parents out there, there are resources, there are groups,
yeah,
and they're starting to form more and more, because so many kids are going through this, and parents
yeah,
are really struggling. And so there's the Kelsey Coalition. There's um, you had one that I actually hadn't heard of that I'll post,
fourth wave now,
and then there was one other that you mentioned.
gender health
Yeah.
query website. I'll send you
Yeah,
the link.
and so, and
Yeah,
there's a resource guide that that a friend of mine actually put together, and so I think that there are starting to be resources for parents, and most importantly to share with medical providers. One of the things that I've been trying
Yes.
to do is just share information with doctors, because
Hmm.
doctors a lot of times just sort of, they focus on what they know, and then they just, they're told, if you have a transgender child, affirm them, and they just sort of go with it
Yeah.
because that's not their training. And
Right.
so I think the efforts, and that's one of the reasons I'm making these videos, is just to get the information out, because
Hmm.
stories like yours are so important. If you had been a different kind of parent, your daughter would currently probably be on cross-sex hormones.
I think so. And yeah, and I have a coworker too who's gone through this with her daughter, and I mean, I think the best conversations that I have are in person. I mean, I've tried sharing things on social media, and I've just gotten attacked, and people misunderstand, but if you can have those conversations in person, it's very helpful. And um, so I just when she was a new employee where I work, and um, we were talking about our kids, and she must have heard something about my daughter, because she goes, and I have a 16-year-old, and I think that our teenagers would have a lot in common. And I said, oh yeah, I said, what's your 16-year-old's name? And she goes, well, she asked me what my daughter's name was, and I said, well, I said her name is this, but she wants to be called this. And she goes, oh, she's like, mine's this, but she wants to be called this. And I said, I said, to tell you the truth, I'm really not that cool with it. And she just like, she got this big smile on her face, and she reached up her hand. She's like, high five. Like, all of a sudden it was like relief to be able to just say, this is crazy. What's going on? And
Yeah,
so,
because it's just you're automatically labeled transphobic and
right.
akin to a Nazi if you question any of this.
And, where we work, those of us who have kids, um, this person and I are the only two people at a workplace with about 20 employees who have teenage daughters, and they both identify as trans. There's
Wow.
something going on,
Yeah.
and if it were more rare like it used to be, I would actually take it more seriously. But we have to really get to the bottom of what's going on, why all these kids.
Well, and even in my case, when I was diagnosed, it was incredibly rare.
Right.
So,
Right.
and yet in my case, that trans identity was 100% a coping mechanism.
Hmm.
And so even when and I've talked to Walt Heyer and Billy Burley, both who went through, full sex change operations to try, and they're older.
Hmm.
So they, and they thought that that would help, and it didn't. So, I don't want to ever say that I know what's right for somebody, but I think it's so important for people to be able to explore underlying issues that might be causing this before progressing towards the idea that they're transgender.
Right.
And they're not allowed to in so many states now because
Right.
he's banned
And
on therapy.
the story that we're told by the trans community is that this gender identity is this fixed, immutable thing that people have, and just the fact that so many people can identify as trans and then later not.
Yeah,
um,
that right there, even just one person doing it
right.
is
But
proof
it's
that that's
way
not
more.
true.
Yeah.
And that's why they're trying so hard to shut us down,
Yeah.
unfortunately. Well,
Yeah.
in our last few minutes, is there anything that we didn't cover that you want to share?
Well, I'm really looking forward to the release of Abigail Schreier's book, Irreversible Damage, the transgender craze that is, what is the subtitle of that? Anyway, that's,
The main title is Irreversible Damage, and it's
yes,
Abigail
Schreier,
Schreier.
yes. Yes,
And
and it's,
Amazon has currently, from
mhm,
what I understand, Amazon is not allowing her to advertise. This is
right,
yet another example of sane voices being silenced.
right, and well researched too. And I remember the full title. Irreversible Damage, the transgender craze that is seducing our daughters. Okay. So I just think that it's so timely. I think that the conversation that we had, I think, I haven't read the book yet because it's not out yet, but I'm just so hopeful that um, this book, I hope it makes a big impact, even if it makes a big impact just because it's controversial.
At least
which
it'll
I
get people talking.
exactly. And I think that people are, if they've been skeptical of this, and they see, someone, is talking about this, if I think it will. I am really hoping that it makes a difference, because what's happening I think it's a tragedy. I mean,
Yeah,
it's a
it's a
huge
whole generation of
financial.
girls
Yes,
that's being sterilized.
right.
I mean,
And I feel like my daughter's going to come out of it and she's going to be okay. I think if she had been born 5 years earlier, and right now she were 21, she would be very vulnerable right now. And so there are some people who are in that, age range that are, I think they're victims of.
yeah, I think they're victims of this
Mhm.
ideology,
Yeah.
and I think that the fact that we're not allowed to even question, and that is something I think that part of it is that most people out there do not know what's going on.
No, they don't.
They
Mm-mm.
they have no clue. It's like you and I were a couple years ago.
Mhm.
We hear about these transgender kids, and oh, that must be so hard, and
Right.
you know, and we don't, and they don't realize that these kids are being pushed to believe that they're inherently flawed, that they're born in the
Mhm.
wrong body, there's something wrong with them that they cannot fix, that
Mhm.
they should, be put on these medical treatments. They just don't know that, and so I
Mhm.
think anytime there's controversy, it allows the opportunity to share information, and hopefully people will start listening.
I hope so too. I think one of the problems that we have right now, and you've talked about how, you've always identified as a liberal, right? Me too. I mean, I've just, you know, I was raised by really liberal parents, always consider myself a liberal. And I think we have attachments to that ideology too, as being, I mean, I was a proud liberal, like we're really proud of that.
I'm
And
tolerant. I'm loving.
yes,
I'm
and
kind.
it's my identity too. Then
Yeah.
where when we're almost, and then we kind of we feel we have allegiance to our politics, and so then we think that we have to accept everything that goes along with that. And I don't think this should be a liberal or conservative issue, because we're really just looking out for the health and safety of people,
Children.
children first of
And
all.
really, as a
Yeah.
liberal,
Uh-huh.
it really should be an issue, because
Right.
one of the reasons that I always identified as a liberal is that I care about kids. I'm a strong advocate for kids.
Yes.
And boy, if you care about kids and you are an advocate for kids, you're going to
Yes.
be really against um, giving these kids medical interventions that harm their bodies and
Yes.
sterilize. I mean, that's to me is like a quintessential liberal stance, is to protect
Right.
kids.
Well, I remember when I first started researching this. Now, you see people criticizing this from all across the board, but people kind of see it as, if you're against this, then you're conservative. And so I was really skeptical of anything that I saw that, was considered conservative. I was like, oh, is it okay for me to read this article from the Federalist? And people really need to get that out of their heads, because once I started researching this, my internet algorithms started changing, where then I wasn't just getting all
Oh,
this liberal
interesting.
echo chamber,
Interesting.
reinforcing the trans ideology. And it's really opened my mind to just being more tolerant of conservatives, and realizing that they actually, have some good ideas too. So
Well,
I
and one of
just,
the things that really helped me move into this, because I was, somebody would talk about conservatives, and I'd kind of,
mhm. Right, me too, right? Hmm.
but I saw Miriam Ben Shalom
Hmm.
on a Heritage
Yes,
Foundation panel, and I was like,
yes,
what?
yeah,
What? And so shout
yeah,
out to Miriam,
yes,
because she really opened my eyes to what's going on, because the reason she and Julia Beck and some of these others have been appearing on with conservatives is because conservatives are the only ones who are willing to give voice to any of this.
hmm,
And ironically, I ended up presenting at an Eagle Forum
Mhm.
convention, which is just something like if you had told me 10 years ago I do, I would, it's
Right.
absolutely no way.
Mhm.
Um, but I realized and that's maybe been something that's been important for me is as a result of this issue is I'm seeing conservatives in a very different light now because I'm seeing them really fighting with passion and
Right.
and it's because they care. It's
Mhm.
because they are seeing what's happening to our children and they're deeply concerned.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, well, thank you for sharing your story, and I will make sure to put some resources on to link to for parents who might have questions. And I'm curious to touch bases with you in a couple of years to see how your daughter's doing.
Yeah, and I'm hoping I'm optimistic, and I'm really hoping too that we see a shift in society too, not just in my own,
I
family.
suspect once people start filing lawsuits,
Yeah.
that's what's going to shift it. Is that you're going to have these kids who are damaged who are going to be suing their physicians for giving them treatments that damage
Mhm.
their bodies. And unfortunately, sometimes it seems like that's the only thing that really changes public policy.
Right. I do think that it's going to change because um, what we're seeing right now is not sustainable. With if all these, it's just not. Unfortunately, there will be a lot of damage done.
Yeah, and that's what's I'm so thankful that you stood up and protected your daughter. Um,
Yeah, it just
yeah.
I was just really following my gut instinct.
Yeah, and I'm so
So
thankful for your ability to see the emperor has no clothes.
right, right.